What's up, everyone? Welcome back to the channel. Today we're finally doing what a lot of you have been asking for, a full PvP class tier list. Not just ranking a couple of specs, not just talking about what's broken, but going through every single class in the game and deciding where they actually belong in the current meta. Now, before we jump into it, I want to explain how I'm doing these rankings because I know someone's going to skip 2 minutes into the video, see their favorite class, and instantly type an angry comment. I'm not ranking individual specs. I'm ranking the entire class. So if a class has one absolutely insane specialization, but the other 3 are average or below average, I'm taking all of that into account. The overall versatility of the class matters. I'm also looking at every type of PvP. We're talking 1v1s, arena, battlegrounds, open world fights, high risk, objective play, survivability, utility, damage, mobility, consistency, everything. A class that's amazing in one situation but terrible everywhere else isn't automatically going to be S tier. Likewise, a class that might not have the biggest burst in the game but performs well in every single type of content deserves credit for that. Another thing to remember is this tier list is based on the current patch. Balance changes happen all the time. A single buff or nerf could move a class up or down an entire tier overnight. So don't take this as your class is dead forever. This is simply where I think everything stands right now after spending a ridiculous amount of time watching high-rated players, fighting these classes myself, and testing a lot of them. And as always, if you disagree with something, good. That's half the fun of making these videos. Leave your own rankings in the comments, because I'm genuinely curious where everyone else thinks these classes belong. Alright, let's stop wasting time. We're starting with one of the biggest surprises in the game. Hashtag Stormbringer. I'm actually starting with Stormbringer because I think this class gets misunderstood a lot. Some people think it's completely broken. Other people think it's easy to counter. The truth is, it's somewhere in the middle. Stormbringer has some of the most explosive damage in the game. When they get to play the game on their own terms, they are terrifying. If you've ever been feared into a full burst combo by a good Stormbringer player, you already know what I'm talking about. Sometimes your health bar just disappears before you even have a chance to react. And that's really the identity of this class. It's explosive, it's fast, it's incredibly mobile, and it punishes mistakes harder than almost any other ranged class. The lightning specialization is easily the standout. The burst windows are insane. Their damage comes out incredibly quickly, and because they have multiple tools to create distance, they can usually force opponents into awkward situations before committing. They're not just standing there hoping someone lets them free cast. They can reposition. They can blink. They can knock people away. They have movement speed. They have defensive options. Everything works together. Now, they're definitely not immortal. A lot of people see the damage and forget that Stormbringers can actually die pretty quickly if someone manages to stay on top of them. Good melee players who rotate interrupts correctly can make life very difficult. But that's where player skill comes in. A great Stormbringer doesn't just rely on damage. They know when to kite. They know when to disengage. They know when to force cooldowns before committing to their own burst. That's why the class has such a high ceiling. Average players might think it's good. Really good players make it look unfair. The Maelstrom specialization deserves a lot more respect too. It doesn't always produce the flashy one-shots that lightning does, but the sustained pressure is ridiculous. Being able to keep pumping out damage while maintaining pressure over longer fights makes them excellent in arenas, especially once healers start falling behind. People often underestimate sustained damage because everyone clips the giant crits. But sustained pressure wins matches. In Battlegrounds, they're incredible. Team fights? Fantastic. Defending objectives? Great. Punishing overextended players? Even better. The support specialization is probably the weakest of the 3, but even then it brings enough utility that it never feels completely useless. That's important. Some classes have one amazing spec and 2 specs you never want to touch. Stormbringer doesn't really have that problem. Overall, I think Stormbringer comfortably belongs in S tier. Not because every specialization is overpowered, but because their strongest builds are among the best in the game, and the rest of the class is still more than solid enough to keep the overall rating extremely high. Definitely one of the safest classes you can invest time into right now. Now let's move to a class that's almost the complete opposite. Hashtag Barbarian. Barbarian is one of those classes that looks much stronger than it actually is. When you're leveling, it feels incredible. Everything dies quickly. You're constantly moving. Big numbers everywhere. You feel unstoppable. Then you hit in-game PvP, and reality hits. The biggest problem with Barbarian isn't damage. It's consistency. Their strongest moments are tied heavily to cooldowns and specific burst windows. Outside of those windows, they can feel surprisingly underwhelming. Against inexperienced players? Sure, you'll run people over. Against coordinated arena teams? They're going to kite you. Force your cooldowns. Line of sight your burst. Reset the fight. And suddenly you're spending half the match trying to reconnect instead of actually dealing damage. Mobility is definitely a strength. No question. They can cover ground quickly. They're excellent at chasing weakened targets. They're solid flag carriers in Battlegrounds. But mobility alone doesn't win fights. Especially when the rest of the meta has so many ways to peel, root, fear, or simply disengage. The Headhunter specialization is easily the strongest option. It has decent burst, good mobility, respectable pressure. Nothing amazing, nothing terrible, just solid. The other specializations, they're much harder to justify. Some of them require very specific setups to produce damage that other classes deliver much more consistently. That's really the issue. Whenever I compare Barbarian to the top melee classes, I always ask myself, why wouldn't I just play the other class? Usually, I don't have a great answer. That doesn't mean Barbarian is bad. It just means the competition is stronger. If the developers give them slightly more reliable pressure or improve their sustained damage, I could absolutely see them climbing a full tier. Right now, though, I think C tier is fair, playable, fun, capable in the right hands. But definitely not a class I'd recommend if your only goal is climbing the PvP ladder. Hashtag Pyromancer. Alright, next up we've got Pyromancer. This is one of those classes that I don't think gets enough credit because it's never the flashiest class in the room. You'll hear everyone talking about the newest one-shot build or whatever class is dominating Twitch clips, but Pyromancer just quietly keeps performing every single patch. And honestly, that's one of the biggest strengths of this class. Consistency. No matter what type of PvP you're playing, Pyromancer usually has an answer. The Incineration specialization is probably my favorite. It revolves around applying constant pressure rather than gambling everything on one combo. You've got strong dots, you've got instant casts during your cooldown windows, and you've got enough mobility that you don't feel like a training dummy whenever a melee player decides you're the target. One thing I really like is that Pyromancer actually rewards good positioning. If you're constantly thinking ahead, rotating your defensives properly, and keeping your spacing, you become incredibly annoying to deal with. A bad Pyromancer dies quickly. A good Pyromancer makes you question every engage. That's a massive difference. The second caster specialization leans more toward traditional spellcasting. Longer casts, higher payoff, bigger crits. It isn't quite as forgiving because interrupted casts hurt your overall pressure, but if your teammates create space for you, the damage is absolutely there. Then you've got the healing specialization. Honestly, I think it's one of the more underrated healers right now. It's not quite on the same level as the absolute top-tier healers we'll talk about later, but it has excellent survivability, good utility, solid throughput, and enough mobility to reposition when fights become chaotic. That's something people overlook. A healer that stays alive is often more valuable than one that simply heals bigger numbers, especially in coordinated arena games. In Battlegrounds, Pyromancer feels fantastic. Large fights naturally let classes shine. You can pressure multiple targets, spread damage everywhere, force healers to constantly react, and eventually someone falls over. In 1v1s, they're also respectable. Not unbeatable, definitely not weak, just consistently good. Honestly, there isn't much I dislike about this class. It doesn't dominate the meta, but it never feels irrelevant either. For me, Pyromancer lands comfortably in a tier. Very strong, very reliable, and honestly one of the safest classes to main because it rarely becomes completely useless after balance patches. Hashtag Ranger. Now, let's talk about Ranger. I'm probably going to upset some Ranger mains here, but I have to be honest. This class is struggling. Can you win games with Ranger? Absolutely. Can great players make it work? Of course they can. The problem is, Every time Ranger succeeds, it feels like they had to work twice as hard as everyone else. That's never a good sign. Let's start with the range specializations. Their damage isn't terrible. It's just predictable. A lot of classes now have multiple defensive cooldowns, mobility tools, or ways to simply ignore what Ranger wants to do. You spend so much time trying to create opportunities that by the time you finally get one, another class would have already killed somebody. That's frustrating. The melee specialization is definitely better. Having access to additional crowd control automatically makes them more valuable. Stuns are always useful, especially in arenas. But even then, their overall pressure just isn't where I'd like it to be. Against inexperienced players? Sure, you'll catch people out. Against coordinated teams? You're going to notice how many weaknesses the class has. The biggest issue is scaling. Early game, Ranger actually feels pretty decent. As more talents unlock and everyone starts getting their full toolkit, Ranger slowly falls behind. Other classes simply gain more. More burst, more utility, more survivability, more mobility. Everything starts stacking against them. Battlegrounds help a little because objectives naturally create more opportunities for range pressure. But even there, I'd usually rather have almost any other ranged DPS. I really think Ranger needs another balance pass. Not a complete redesign, just something that gives them a stronger identity again. Because right now, they're kind of floating in the middle without excelling anywhere. For me, they're sitting in D tier. Not because they're impossible to play. Because every other class simply offers more. Hashtag Witch Doctor. Now let's move back to one of my favorite classes in the game. Witch Doctor. This class has quietly become an absolute monster, and I still think a lot of people underestimate it. The healing specialization alone is enough to make this class relevant. The amount of sustained healing they can pump out while still contributing utility is incredible. They're difficult to pressure. They have answers for a lot of situations. And unlike some healers, they don't instantly collapse the second melee players connect. That's huge. The Shadowhunter specialization is where things really become interesting. If you know how to manage cooldowns, track enemy defensives, and choose the right targets, this spec absolutely farms people. Its burst isn't always as explosive as something like Rune Master or Tinker, but it doesn't need to be, because the pressure never really stops. That's what separates strong players from average ones. Average players chase damage meters. Great players create pressure that eventually wins fights. Shadowhunter does exactly that. The third specialization still isn't played nearly enough. There's simply not enough data to confidently rank it alongside the other two. But honestly, it doesn't even matter that much. The other specs are carrying this class incredibly hard. In arenas, they're amazing. In Battlegrounds, they're amazing. Open world fights? Fantastic. High risk? Also extremely dangerous. The more coordinated your team becomes, the stronger Witch Doctor feels. This isn't necessarily a beginner-friendly class. There's definitely a learning curve. Managing cooldowns correctly, knowing when to commit, understanding positioning. All of those things matter. But once you master it, the payoff is huge. For me, Witch Doctor comfortably sits in S tier. One of the strongest all-around classes currently available. And honestly, I wouldn't be surprised if we eventually see some balance changes aimed directly at it. Cultist. Alright, next up we've got Cultist. This is one of those classes that's been all over the place recently. Every time a balance patch comes out, people immediately ask the same question. Did Cultist finally die? And every single time, the answer is pretty much the same. Not even close. Yes, they've taken nerfs. Yes, some of their strongest mechanics aren't nearly as oppressive as they were before. But people always overreact whenever a top-tier class gets toned down. There's a huge difference between getting nerfed and becoming weak. Cultist is still a very dangerous class. Let's start with the caster specialization. In my opinion, this is still the best way to play the class. It has excellent pressure, really solid burst, great control over fights, and once you understand your cooldown rotation, you can create kill opportunities almost whenever you want. What separates good cultists from average ones isn't necessarily mechanics. It's patience. A lot of players panic. They throw everything immediately. They waste cooldowns into defensive abilities. Then they wonder why they can't finish kills. Experienced cultists wait. They bait cooldowns first. Then they commit. And when they do, people die incredibly fast. The melee specialization is still strong too. The recent changes definitely slowed it down. There's no denying that. Losing some of that insane uptime hurts, especially against mobile classes. But it still has excellent sustained damage and enough survivability to stay relevant throughout long fights. It's just no longer one of those specs that completely overwhelms people through sheer pressure alone. Now it actually requires some planning, which honestly, I think is healthier for the game. The healing specialization isn't bad either. I wouldn't call it one of the elite healers, but it's perfectly capable if you know what you're doing. Good utility, decent survivability, solid healing output, nothing spectacular, nothing weak. When I look at Cultist as a whole, I don't see a class that dominates every situation. I see a class that's consistently strong across almost everything. Arena? Excellent. Open world? Excellent. High risk? Still scary. Battlegrounds? Very respectable. That's why I still think it deserves a tier. Maybe not the unstoppable monster it once was, but definitely nowhere near falling out of the meta. ## Guardian. Guardian is probably one of the hardest classes to rank. Not because it's complicated, because it's inconsistent. Some matches, you feel unstoppable. Other matches, you barely touch your opponent. And almost all of that comes down to one thing. Mobility. Guardian hits incredibly hard. Nobody argues that. If they manage to connect, you're going to feel it. Especially if they're playing the Gladiator specialization. Their burst can be ridiculous. Against players who don't respect cooldowns, they absolutely delete people. The problem is actually getting there. Modern PvP is filled with slows, roots, knockbacks, teleports, movement abilities. Guardian doesn't always have reliable answers for those. So against experienced ranged players, sometimes you spend half the fight running, and that's never where you want to be. The Inspiration specialization has some interesting utility. It definitely has moments where it shines, but compared to some of the stronger support-oriented specs in the game, it just feels average. Then we have the Tank specialization. Before the tank changes, you could make an argument. Now, not really. The damage reduction tanks received hit Guardian pretty hard. You're giving up damage without gaining enough to justify it. Outside of very specific situations, I just don't think it's worth bringing. One thing Guardian absolutely deserves credit for is simplicity. This is one of the easiest melee classes to understand. Your win condition is obvious. Connect. Force cooldowns. Stay aggressive. Finish the kill. Simple. But simplicity also means predictability. Experienced players know exactly what you're trying to do, and they have answers prepared. Battlegrounds definitely help Guardian. Large fights naturally create more opportunities to connect. Objective defense is solid. Holding choke points feels great. But arenas, especially against coordinated ranged teams, can become incredibly frustrating. Overall, Guardian lands in B tier for me. Strong enough to succeed. Too many bad matchups to climb any higher. ## Necromancer. Now we're getting into one of the strongest casters currently in the game. Necromancer. Honestly, this class reminds me a lot of old-school warlocks. Not because they play exactly the same, but because fighting them feels exhausting. They're tanky. They're disruptive. They're constantly applying pressure. And somehow, they just refuse to die. That's really the first thing people notice. You commit everything trying to kill them, then suddenly they're back at half health. Their pet is still alive. They've got another defensive available, and now you're the one running out of cooldowns. That's incredibly frustrating to fight against. The animation specialization is fantastic. Excellent sustained damage. Strong utility. Very consistent pressure throughout longer fights. Then you've got Rime. Another specialization that continues applying pressure while controlling the pace of the game. Neither of these specs necessarily relies on one massive one-shot combo. Instead, they slowly overwhelm opponents. And honestly, that's often even stronger. The death specialization still hasn't been explored as much by the community. I think there's definitely more potential there than people realize. We'll probably see more experimentation over the next few weeks. But even if that spec ended up being average, the rest of the class already carries Necromancer into the top tier. Their crowd control is excellent. Fear remains incredibly valuable. Their stun creates opportunities. Their survivability forces enemy teams to overcommit. And if they overcommit, their teammates usually capitalize. Battlegrounds. Fantastic. Arena. Excellent. High risk. one of the safest casters available. Even in duels, they're incredibly annoying to bring down. Honestly, the only real weakness I see is that they aren't the easiest class for beginners. Managing pets, managing cooldowns, tracking positioning. There's a lot happening at once. But once you become comfortable, the class rewards you massively. Necromancer earns an easy S tier from me. Not because it's unbeatable, but because it performs at an extremely high level across every major PvP mode in the game. The biggest sleeper class in the game. Before we jump into another class, I actually want to talk about something that almost nobody mentions when they make these tier lists. Everyone always asks, what's the best class? Asterisk. But I think a much better question is, what's the most underrated class? Asterisk. Because those are usually the classes that climb rating the fastest. Nobody knows the matchup. Nobody respects the cooldowns. Nobody understands what they're supposed to interrupt. That's where free wins come from. People spend all day preparing for the Tinkers, the Stormbringers, the Rune Masters. Then they queue into a class they've seen twice all week. That's when mistakes happen. And speaking of underrated, let's talk about Blood Mage. Hashtag Blood Mage. Blood Mage has one of the strangest reputations in the game. Half the community thinks it's terrible. The other half thinks it's secretly overpowered. Personally, I think both sides are exaggerating. Blood Mage isn't weak. It also isn't carrying people for free. It's one of those classes that scales almost entirely with player skill. When you fight an average Blood Mage, you're probably not going to remember the match. Their pressure feels manageable. Their burst is telegraphed. They don't seem particularly scary. Then you fight someone who's mastered the class, and suddenly everything changes. Their health barely moves. They're constantly healing through damage. Every trade somehow favors them. You finally think you've won. Then they stabilize, recover, and completely flip the fight. That's what makes Blood Mage dangerous. It doesn't usually overwhelm you immediately. It slowly drags you into a losing battle. The caster build is definitely the strongest option. Their sustained pressure is respectable, and if opponents ignore their cast windows for even a few seconds, the damage ramps up surprisingly quickly. The biggest weakness is obvious though. Long casts. Against coordinated teams, good interrupts make life difficult. Against melee players who never leave your side, you'll definitely have to work for your damage. That's why positioning is everything. Good Blood Mages almost never stand where people expect them to. They're already moving before danger arrives. They're already planning their next position. That's something you only really appreciate after fighting experienced players. The melee specialization is interesting. I don't think it's nearly as bad as people make it out to be. It simply asks a lot more from the player. Cooldown management. Spacing. Knowing exactly when to commit. There's very little room for mistakes. When played perfectly, it absolutely works. The problem is, most players don't play perfectly, which is why the spec often looks much weaker than it actually is. The tank build suffered quite a bit after the balance adjustments. Before those changes, you could make a real argument for it. Now, it feels more like a niche pick than something you'd consistently queue into competitive PvP with. Overall, Blood Mage lands somewhere in the middle. Not exciting enough for S tier. Definitely stronger than people give it credit for. I'd comfortably place it in B tier. And honestly, if it receives even a small quality of life buff, I could see it moving into A. Hashtag now let's talk about a class everyone argues about. Templars. I swear. Every single week I see someone saying, this class is broken. Then someone else replies, no, it's completely useless. The truth? It's neither. Templar is one of the most matchup-dependent classes in the entire game. Against certain classes, they look unstoppable. Against others, they spend the whole fight chasing someone they can't catch. That's the biggest issue. Mobility. When Templar reaches you, good luck. The Crusader specialization has incredible durability. Excellent self-healing. Very respectable burst. And enough sustained pressure that long fights usually favor them. You can't simply trade cooldowns forever. Eventually, they outlast you. That's why they're so effective in arenas. Especially with a competent healer beside them. Every minute the game continues, their value increases. Open world PvP? Also fantastic. If they catch someone without cooldowns, the fight is usually over. The biggest problem appears against highly mobile ranged classes. Stormbringer, Pyromancer, certain ranger builds. Good players simply refuse to stand still. And every second Templar spends chasing is another second they're not dealing damage. The Zealot specialization is much harder to evaluate. I've seen clips where it absolutely deletes people. I've also watched players struggle to kill anything. That usually tells me the spec has a very high skill ceiling. Strong in the right hands. Average for everyone else. The tank specialization. It's okay. Nothing more. Perfectly playable. But I don't think it's carrying the class upward. Overall, Templar remains one of the safest melee picks in the game. Strong survivability. Reliable damage. Great arena value. Excellent objective defender. For me, they're comfortably sitting in a tier. Not quite among the monsters at the very top, but absolutely a class I'd recommend if you enjoy melee gameplay. Now before we move into the next class, I want to change things up. Instead of immediately talking about another class, let's answer a question I get almost every day. If you were making a brand new account today, what class would you start with? That's actually a much harder question than simply asking what's strongest. Because the strongest class isn't always the easiest class. And that's exactly what we'll talk about next. Best classes for new players. Alright, let's take a quick break from the tier list because I think this is something a lot of people overlook. The strongest class in the game isn't always the best class to start with. Some classes are incredibly powerful, but they only become powerful once you've put dozens or even hundreds of hours into them. If you're constantly misusing cooldowns or standing in bad positions, it doesn't matter if you're playing an S-tier class. You're still going to lose. So if I were starting from scratch today, these are the types of classes I'd look at. Pyromancer is probably one of the easiest ranged classes to learn. It teaches positioning. It teaches cooldown management. You have enough mobility to recover from mistakes, but not so much that you develop bad habits. Templars are another great option. They're forgiving. They have strong self-healing. You don't instantly explode every time someone looks at you. That gives newer players time to actually learn PvP instead of spending every fight staring at the respawn screen. Guardian is another solid beginner melee. Simple rotation. Simple objectives. Get on your target. Stay aggressive. Trade cooldowns intelligently. Done. Now, would these be my picks if I wanted rank 1 tomorrow? Probably not. But if your goal is learning the game, these classes are fantastic. Alright, back to the rankings. #Starcaller. Starcaller might honestly be the weirdest class in the entire roster. Some games, they feel completely unstoppable. Other games, you wonder if they're even playing the same game as everyone else. And almost all of that comes down to positioning. This class absolutely loves stationary fights. If enemies are forced to push into your team, Starcaller becomes a nightmare. They can establish their zone, set up pressure, control space, and continuously punish anyone who walks forward. But PvP rarely works that cleanly, especially in arena. Good players don't just stand there. They pillar, they kite, they rotate defensives, they force movement. And movement is exactly what Starcaller doesn't always want. That's why opinions on this class vary so much. If you only play Battlegrounds, you'll probably think Starcaller deserves a tier, maybe even higher. Those giant team fights play directly into everything the class wants to do. You always have multiple targets. There's constant pressure. People aren't paying attention to every spell. Your damage adds up incredibly quickly. Arena tells a different story. Suddenly, every cast matters. Every interrupt matters. Every positioning mistake gets punished. Against coordinated teams, you have to work much harder for your value. The melee specialization is respectable. Nothing amazing. Nothing terrible. It brings decent sustained damage and enough survivability that you don't instantly fall over. The healing specialization feels very similar. Capable, reliable, but not something I'd build an entire composition around. Overall, Starcaller doesn't really have a bad specialization. The problem is, it also doesn't have that one specialization that completely carries the class. Everything feels good, not incredible, just good. That's why I'm placing Starcaller comfortably in B tier. A perfectly viable class. One that shines in Battlegrounds, but one that struggles to consistently compete with the absolute best arena classes. #Spellsworn. Now here's a class I think has quietly climbed the rankings over the last few weeks. Spellsworn. If you haven't fought a really good one yet, you probably don't understand why people rate this class so highly. Their biggest strength isn't actually damage. It's freedom. Everything about this class feels smooth. Movement, cooldowns, escaping danger, creating pressure. They're constantly doing something productive. Good Spellsworn players are incredibly frustrating to lock down. Just when you think you've cornered them, they're already somewhere else. That's a huge advantage in modern PvP. Mobility creates opportunities. It creates survivability. It creates pressure. And this class has plenty of all three. The caster specialization is easily the star of the show. Strong burst. Excellent sustained pressure. Fantastic mobility. Reliable crowd control. It's one of those specs where every part of the kit works together naturally. Nothing feels wasted. Nothing feels awkward. The melee specialization still hasn't reached the same level. It's perfectly playable. I've seen talented players make it work. But compared to the caster build, it's clearly behind. I wouldn't call it weak. I'd call it unfinished. It feels like it's only 1 or 2 adjustments away from becoming a genuine threat. Then we have the tank specialization. After the recent balance changes, it's still serviceable. Certainly better than some tank builds, but nowhere near defining the class anymore. And honestly, that's probably healthier for the game. Looking at the class overall, Arena? Fantastic. Battlegrounds? Excellent. Open World? Excellent. High Risk? One of the strongest roamers because they're so difficult to pin down. If I had to recommend a class for experienced players looking for something rewarding, Spellsworn would be near the top of that list. It isn't the easiest class to master, but the payoff is absolutely worth it. For me, this class lands comfortably in a tier. And I honestly wouldn't argue with someone who placed it at the very bottom of S. That's how close it is. Now, we've talked about some of the strongest classes. We've talked about some of the weakest. But I think it's time to discuss the elephant in the room. The class that almost everyone agrees is completely overtuned right now. And honestly, if balance changes don't happen soon, I wouldn't be surprised if this becomes the most played class in PvP. Let's talk about Tinker. The most dominant class in the current meta. Alright, we've talked about classes that are underrated. We've talked about classes that are solid. Now it's time to talk about the class that, in my opinion, sets the standard for everyone else. Whenever I'm comparing classes, this is the one I keep coming back to. Because I always ask myself, can this class consistently beat Tinker? Asterisk. If the answer is no, there's a good chance it's not S tier. Hashtag Tinker. Tinker is one of those classes that feels like it has an answer for almost every situation. Need mobility? It's got it. Need survivability? It's got it. Need burst damage? Absolutely. Need sustained pressure? No problem. Need utility for your team? Again, it's got that too. That's what makes Tinker so difficult to balance. It isn't just incredible at one thing. It's incredibly good at almost everything. And that's honestly a dangerous combination. Let's start with mobility. One thing that separates elite PvP classes from average ones is the ability to choose when fights happen. Tinker controls that better than almost anyone. If they want to engage, they usually can. If they want to disengage, good luck stopping them. That's incredibly valuable. People always focus on damage numbers, but positioning wins games. A class that controls positioning naturally becomes much stronger than the damage numbers alone suggest. Then we have the damage. It's explosive, but it also feels consistent. Some classes only become scary every 2 minutes when all their cooldowns line up. Tinker constantly feels threatening. Even outside major cooldowns, they're capable of forcing defensive abilities. That means when the real burst arrives, you often don't have anything left to answer it. That's exactly how great Tinker players win games. They don't rely on one combo. They slowly remove your options. Then they finish you. The healing specialization deserves a ton of credit too. I honestly think it's one of the most complete healer kits currently available. Strong emergency healing, reliable sustained healing, excellent mobility, great utility. It's difficult to pressure. Even when teams commit everything, a skilled Tinker healer somehow finds a way to survive. That's frustrating for opponents, but it's exactly what makes the class so valuable. Then there's the mechanical skill ceiling. This isn't a beginner class. Not even close. There's a lot happening. Managing cooldown rotations, resource management, movement, target selection, knowing when to play aggressively, knowing when to peel. The better the player, the stronger the class becomes. That's something I always appreciate in PvP design. Strong classes should reward skill, and Tinker absolutely does. Now, Is it unbeatable? No, nothing is. If you pressure them properly. Coordinate interrupts.
Rotate crowd control intelligently. They absolutely can lose. The problem is, most teams don't do that consistently. And because of that, Tinker dominates. Arena? S tier. Battlegrounds? S tier. Open world? S tier. Small-scale fights? Fantastic. Large-scale fights? Fantastic. High risk? One of the safest classes you can possibly bring. If someone asked me today, I only want one character for PvP, Tinker would probably be my recommendation. Not because it's the easiest. Because it's the complete package. For me. Easy S tier. And honestly, it's one of the benchmark classes the rest of the roster should be balanced around. Hashtag the class everyone underrates. Now here's a class I don't think gets nearly enough respect. Not because it's secretly broken, but because people keep judging it based on bad players. Rune Master. This class is terrifying in the hands of someone who actually understands setup. The biggest mistake people make when talking about Rune Master is only looking at highlight clips. Sure. You'll see insane burst montages. People getting deleted before they can react. Those clips are real. But that's not why Rune Master is strong. The real strength is control. Everything about the class revolves around preparation. Planning. Setting traps. Forcing mistakes. Good Rune Masters don't randomly burst. They create situations where escaping becomes almost impossible. Then they commit. That's a huge difference. The Rift specialization is obviously the headline act. Ridiculous burst potential. Excellent mobility. Enough utility to survive longer than you'd expect. When cooldowns line up, almost every class has to respect them. But here's something I don't hear enough people talking about. The class isn't nearly as forgiving as people think. Miss your setup. Waste your mobility. Blow cooldowns into defensive abilities. Suddenly you're much less threatening. That's why average Rune Masters often look balanced, while elite Rune Masters look unstoppable. There's a massive skill gap.
The engraving-focused build feels much more methodical, less explosive, more consistent, better suited for players who enjoy controlling fights instead of ending them instantly. It doesn't produce viral clips. It wins games. Sometimes that's even stronger. In Battlegrounds, Rune Master is fantastic at picking isolated targets. In arenas, it thrives with teammates who understand coordinated burst windows. In open-world PvP, it's one of the scariest ambush classes in the game. Overall, I don't think Rune Master is the easiest class to master, but if you're willing to invest the time, the reward is enormous. I'd comfortably place it in high A tier, and if future balance changes slightly improve its consistency, I could absolutely see it joining the S tier conversation. Now we've covered some of the biggest heavy hitters in the current meta, but we're not done yet. There are still several classes sitting right in the middle of the rankings. Classes that can absolutely carry games, but only under the right conditions. Some of them are one balance patch away from becoming meta. Others are slowly falling behind. Let's get into those next. Hashtag the classes that are just one patch away. One thing I've learned over the years playing PvP games is this. The difference between an A-tier class and an S-tier class is usually much smaller than people think. Sometimes all it takes is a 5% damage buff, or one cooldown being reduced by 10 seconds, or one extra mobility tool. Suddenly, everyone's re-rolling. That's why I always tell people, don't just chase whatever's broken today. Play something you actually enjoy. Because the meta changes. Skill usually doesn't. That brings us to another class that I think is closer to the top than people realize. Hashtag Sun Cleric. Sun Cleric has one of the most complete support kits in the game. The first thing everyone notices is the healing. It's ridiculous. Burst healing, sustained healing, emergency cooldowns. The class has answers for almost everything. But what really separates good Sun Clerics from average ones isn't the healing numbers. It's decision-making. Knowing when not to heal. That sounds weird. But hear me out. Bad healers panic. Someone loses 30% health. They instantly commit a major cooldown. Good healers know what's actually dangerous. Sometimes your teammate can comfortably sit at half health. Sometimes they can't survive another second. Recognizing the difference is what makes elite healers. Sun Cleric rewards exactly that. The offensive specialization deserves way more respect too. A lot of players still think of this class as the healer. That's a mistake. Its range damage is surprisingly high. More importantly, it's consistent. You're constantly contributing. You're not waiting 2 minutes for one giant burst combo. You're helping secure kills throughout the entire fight. The melee specialization is probably the weakest option. It's not bad. It just doesn't stand out. The damage is respectable. The survivability is decent. But compared to some of the stronger melee classes, it simply doesn't bring enough unique strengths. Where Sun Cleric really shines is organized PvP, arena, rated battlegrounds, objective-based fights. Anywhere teammates can actually benefit from everything the class provides. If you're mostly playing solo, you'll still do well. But coordinated groups bring out the absolute best in this class. Overall, I'm giving Sun Cleric A tier, very close to S. 1 or 2 small improvements could easily push it into the highest category. #Venomancer. Venomancer might be the hardest class in the game to judge. Not because it's weak, not because it's overpowered, because nobody seems to play it the same way. Every Venomancer I run into feels completely different. Some focus entirely on damage over time. Others play for control. Some somehow become nearly impossible to kill. Others explode in 5 seconds. It's a very flexible class. The downside of flexibility is inconsistency. The damage over time build is probably the most popular. It slowly builds pressure, forces healers to spend mana, creates awkward situations over longer fights. Against inexperienced players, it's incredibly frustrating. People ignore the dots, forget to cleanse, stay in bad positions. Before they realize what's happening, their health bar has disappeared. Experienced players obviously deal with it better, but that doesn't make the pressure disappear. It simply means Venomancer has to be smarter about target selection. The melee specialization is honestly underrated. I've watched a few incredibly skilled players make it look phenomenal. Constant pressure, excellent mobility, very annoying to pin down. The problem is, that level of performance isn't common. Most players never reach that ceiling. So while the potential is definitely there, I can't rank the class solely based on what the top 1% can do. The healing specialization feels balanced, reliable, useful, but not game-breaking. Exactly where support classes should be. Then there's the tank build. After the recent balance shifts, I just don't see enough value. You're incredibly durable, sure, but if you're not creating meaningful pressure, teams simply ignore you. Modern PvP rewards impact, not just survivability. Overall, Venomancer lands comfortably in B tier, a class with plenty of potential. One that's probably stronger than most people think, but still lacking that defining specialization that completely changes the meta. #Reaper. Now, let's talk about Reaper. This class has probably disappointed more players than any other class I've talked about today. Not because it's unplayable, because expectations were incredibly high. People expected a monster. Instead, they got a class that's still searching for its identity. The biggest issue isn't damage. The biggest issue isn't survivability. It's that nothing truly stands out. Whenever I compare Reaper to other melee classes, I keep asking myself, what does Reaper do better? And honestly, that's a difficult question to answer. Some classes dominate sustained fights. Others specialize in burst. Some bring incredible crowd control. Others become impossible to kill. Reaper feels like it tries to do a little bit of everything, without becoming exceptional at anything. That's dangerous in competitive PvP, because specialists usually beat generalists. The aggressive build has moments where it feels great. Good mobility, decent pressure, respectable burst windows. But they're inconsistent. Miss one opportunity, and suddenly you're waiting again. The defensive build suffered heavily after recent balance adjustments. It simply doesn't create enough threat anymore. Players aren't scared of ignoring it. That's never where you want a tank-oriented specialization to be. I don't think Reaper needs a complete redesign. Honestly, a handful of targeted buffs could completely change public perception. better sustained pressure, slightly stronger cooldowns, a little more utility. Suddenly the class becomes much more attractive. But today, looking at the current meta, I have to be honest. Reaper sits in C tier. Playable, capable, but overshadowed by too many stronger alternatives. We've still got several major classes left to rank, including a few that I know are going to start arguments in the comments. Because next, we're talking about classes that players either massively overrate or massively underrate. And I guarantee at least one of my next rankings is going to surprise people. Hashtag the most overrated class. Alright, this next one is probably going to get me into trouble. Every single time I stream, every single time someone loses to this class, the chat immediately starts saying the exact same thing. That class is completely broken. Asterisk. And honestly, I don't agree. I'm talking about Knight of Sorrow. Now before everyone starts typing, hear me out. A class can be strong without being overpowered. There's a huge difference. Hashtag Knight of Sorrow. Knight of Sorrow punishes mistakes better than almost any melee class. If you waste your mobility, if you overextend, if you don't respect their setup, you're probably dead. That's why so many people think it's overpowered. But if you actually watch high-level PvP, the class suddenly looks much more balanced. Good players don't panic. They track cooldowns. They save mobility. They know exactly when the knight wants to engage. That changes everything. The war specialization is definitely the strongest build. Good sustained pressure. Reliable burst. Strong utility for pulling targets back into the fight. It doesn't rely entirely on huge critical hits. Instead, it slowly forces mistakes. That's exactly what good melee classes should do. The Hellfire build is much more explosive. When everything lines up, it can produce some ridiculous numbers. But it also has more downtime. Miss your opportunity, and suddenly you're waiting much longer before becoming threatening again. Consistency matters. That's why I still prefer the war build. Then we have the tank specialization. After all the recent balance changes, it's simply average, useful in specific situations, not something I'd queue every match with. One thing I absolutely love about Knight of Sorrow is how much game knowledge it rewards. Knowing enemy cooldowns, tracking trinkets, predicting movement. Everything matters. The better your understanding of PvP, the stronger the class becomes. That's a healthy design. Overall, Knight of Sorrow sits comfortably in B tier. A very good class, definitely capable of climbing, but not the unstoppable monster people sometimes claim it is. Hashtag Chronomancer. Chronomancer is probably the smartest class in the game. Not mechanically, mentally. This class rewards planning more than almost anything else. If you're constantly thinking ahead, Chronomancer feels incredible. If you're reacting instead of predicting, you're going to struggle. The healing specialization is easily one of the highlights. Strong sustained healing, excellent utility, and most importantly, fantastic defensive tools. Good Chronomancers don't simply heal damage. They prevent it from happening in the first place. That's a huge difference. Preventing damage is almost always more efficient than recovering from it. The offensive specialization follows the same philosophy. It isn't about instantly deleting someone. It's about controlling the pace of the fight, slowing the game down, creating favorable trades, making opponents waste cooldowns. Eventually, the fight naturally swings in your favor. That's why experienced arena players love this class. Everything feels deliberate, calculated. There's very little randomness involved. The downside is obvious. Chronomancer has a very high learning curve. This isn't something I'd recommend as your very first character. There's simply too much to manage. Cooldown timing, positioning, target priority, defensive rotations. Every decision matters. But if you enjoy strategic gameplay, very few classes are as satisfying. In Battlegrounds, they're excellent support. In arenas, they become even stronger, especially alongside coordinated teammates. Overall, Chronomancer earns a strong A tier from me. Not flashy, not overloaded, just consistently excellent. Primalist. Now let's move on to one of the strongest frontline fighters currently available. Primalist. If you enjoy long fights, constant pressure, and refusing to die, you're probably going to love this class. Primalist doesn't always produce the biggest burst. That's never really been its identity. Instead, it slowly takes over fights. Every second you're trading blows, the Primalist gets stronger. They sustain. They recover. They keep applying pressure. Meanwhile, you're slowly running out of options. That's incredibly difficult to deal with. The melee specialization is absolutely the star of the class. Fantastic survivability. Excellent sustained damage. Enough mobility to stay connected. Everything just works. The caster specialization is surprisingly solid too. It doesn't reach the same level, but it offers much safer gameplay. You sacrifice some pressure in exchange for much greater flexibility. That makes it appealing for players who prefer ranged combat without giving up durability. One thing I really appreciate is how forgiving the class feels. Small mistakes don't immediately lose you the fight. You usually have opportunities to recover. That's fantastic for newer players. Yet experienced players still find plenty of room to optimize. That's exactly what you want from class design. Battlegrounds? Excellent. Arena? Excellent. World PvP? Excellent. Honestly, Primalist feels good almost everywhere. The only thing keeping it out of the absolute top spot is that it rarely ends fights instantly. Instead, it wins through consistency. For me, that's more than enough for S tier. Alright, we've only got a handful of classes left. And interestingly enough, some of the remaining classes are the hardest ones to rank. Not because they're weak, not because they're overpowered, because almost nobody agrees on them. Some players think they're hidden gems. Others think they're completely outdated. So let's finish this tier list by looking at those controversial picks before I reveal my final rankings from worst all the way to the best class in the current PvP meta. The hidden gems of the meta. One thing I've noticed over the last few weeks is that people tend to judge classes based on popularity. If a class isn't everywhere, people assume it's weak. That's not always true. Sometimes a class is simply difficult. Sometimes it doesn't create flashy highlight clips. Sometimes it's just waiting for the right player to figure it out. These next few classes fall exactly into that category. Hashtag Witch Hunter. Witch Hunter is one of the most technical classes in the game. When you first pick it up, it honestly feels average. Nothing really jumps out at you. You're not deleting people in 2 globals. You're not impossible to kill. You don't have 20 different escape buttons. Everything feels balanced. But then you watch someone who actually knows the class, and suddenly it looks completely different. The biggest strength of Witch Hunter is control. Not crowd control, fight control. Good Witch Hunter players decide where engagements happen. They force people into bad positions. They punish overextensions. They're incredibly patient. That's something newer players struggle with. Most people want to charge in immediately. A great Witch Hunter waits. They let the opponent make the first mistake. Then they capitalize. The melee build is definitely the strongest option. It has enough burst to finish targets, enough mobility to stick to people, and enough utility to survive longer than you'd expect. The ranged build feels much more situational. Some matches it's excellent. Other matches it struggles to create meaningful pressure. I wouldn't call it weak. It's just inconsistent. Overall, I think Witch Hunter lands comfortably in a tier. High skill ceiling, strong matchup potential, and a class that rewards intelligent decision-making far more than raw mechanics. Hashtag Felsworn. Now here's a class that's quietly become one of my favorite picks for experienced players. Felsworn. This class has something that every great PvP class needs. Tempo. They're constantly dictating the pace of the game. If they want to speed things up, they can. If they want to disengage, they usually can. That flexibility makes them incredibly dangerous. The caster build is outstanding. Strong pressure, great mobility, reliable crowd control. Excellent survivability if you know how to rotate cooldowns. Everything fits together naturally. The melee build still feels like it has room to grow. I've seen players absolutely dominate with it. I've also seen players look completely lost. That usually tells me the specialization has a huge skill ceiling. It's not carrying average players, but experienced players can absolutely make it work. The defensive specialization sits somewhere in the middle. Useful, flexible, not game-changing. Honestly, Felsworn reminds me of those classes that become stronger every month. Not because they're getting buffs, because the player base keeps discovering new optimizations. Every tournament, every high-rated arena, someone finds another trick, another combo, another way to squeeze extra value out of the class. That's exciting. For me, Felsworn earns a high A tier, very close to breaking into S. Hashtag my biggest surprise of the patch. If you'd asked me a month ago what class would surprise me the most, I probably would have given you a completely different answer. But after spending more time in PvP, watching tournaments, talking with top players. One class kept showing up, not because it was overpowered, because it kept quietly winning. That's something people ignore. Winning quietly is still winning. You don't need giant one-shot montages. You don't need clips going viral. Sometimes consistency is stronger than hype. That's exactly why I think this next balance patch is going to shake everything up. I honestly expect at least 4 or 5 classes to move around the rankings. Stormbringer might finally receive adjustments. Tinker probably gets looked at. Some of the weaker melee classes desperately need help. And I wouldn't be surprised if one of today's B-tier classes becomes tomorrow's S-tier monster. That's how quickly PvP metas evolve. Hashtag final tier list. Alright, after everything we've talked about, here's where I personally have every class. Hashtag S-tier. These are the classes I'd recommend if your only goal is winning PvP consistently. They perform almost everywhere. Arena, Battlegrounds, Open World, small-scale fights, large-scale fights. They're always relevant. Tinker, Stormbringer, Necromancer, Primalist. These are the benchmark classes of the current meta. If you're building a competitive team, you'll probably see at least one of these. Hashtag a tier. Excellent classes. Some are only one small balance patch away from S. Others require a little more player skill to unlock their full potential. Pyromancer, Cultist, Chronomancer, Templar, Witch Hunter, Felsworn, Rune Master, Sun Cleric. You can absolutely climb with these. In the right hands. Some of them honestly feel like S tier already. B tier. Good classes. Perfectly playable. They simply have more weaknesses than the classes above them. Usually matchup dependent. Usually needing slightly more effort for the same results. Blood Mage, Venomancer, Guardian, Knight of Sorrow, Starcaller. Nothing wrong with playing these. I just think the current meta favors other options. C tier. These are the classes I'd like to see receive some attention. Not terrible, just clearly falling behind. Reaper, Barbarian. They still have dedicated players doing well with them, but they're working much harder than they probably should. Hashtag D tier. The only classes I genuinely think need meaningful improvements before I'd recommend them competitively. Ranger. Can skilled players still make it work? Absolutely. People win on every class. But if we're talking average performance, I think Ranger needs the most help right now. Hashtag final thoughts. At the end of the day, don't let any tier list decide what you enjoy playing. I've seen players dominate on classes everyone called bad. I've also watched people lose every match while playing whatever YouTube said was overpowered. Tier lists matter. Player skill matters more. Understanding matchups, tracking cooldowns, communicating with your team, positioning correctly. Those things will win you far more games than simply re-rolling every patch. So if your favorite class ended up lower than you expected, don't panic. The next update could completely change everything. And honestly, I hope it does. Healthy PvP is constantly evolving. No class should stay at the top forever. No class should stay at the bottom forever. That's what keeps the game interesting. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to leave a like because this one took a long time to put together. Subscribe if you want more PvP guides, class breakdowns, and tier lists whenever the meta changes. And now I want to hear from you. What's your number one class in the game right now? What's the most overrated class? What's the biggest sleeper pick? Drop your own tier list down in the comments because I'm definitely going to be reading them. Thanks for watching. I'll catch you guys in the next one. Peace.